Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Thier, and I am the Executive Director here at the Overseas Development Institute. Thank you so much for coming to what I think is going to be a fantastically important and, needless to say, as topical as you can get conversation about the future of the Paris Agreement. One or two things to start us off. First of all, we are not expecting a fire drill today, I will say that. So if there's a fire alarm, please, there are fire exits on both sides of the building, and please make your way out calmly. We're supposed to say that at the beginning of every event, but we're all thinking about it, especially these days, unfortunately. We have a terrific panel of speakers here today, which I will let Isabel, our chair, introduce to you. But I want to start out just by saying a few things to warm up the discussion. The first of all, because I have a hard time hiding it, so I'm just going to say it, I'm angry. I'm angry at what happened in London this weekend in my newly adopted home. And I'm angry at what happened on Thursday. And I'm angry because I think, as the panel is going to talk about, we have been on an incredibly important journey over the last couple of decades to find common ground and to think about how to address what is one of the most fundamental challenges, not only of our time, but I think probably that humanity has ever faced. And in seeing that process and the incredible progress that we made, culminating in the passage of the Sustainable Development Goals, which put climate at the center of a developed and equitable planet, and then the Paris Agreement following immediately after that, we reached a high point of cooperation, of concern, of a goading to action for all of us. And to see that move backward, I think, is deeply troubling. So I just want to say four things, please, welcome, that I think we know. We know that this planet is heating up. And this, again, is not an abstract thing. I was in Uganda and Kenya last week that are facing, once again, unprecedented levels of drought. 15 of the last 16 years are the highest ever temperatures recorded on record. There's this terrible evidence of a 17-mile-long crack formed last week in an Arctic ice shelf. So these are things that are happening today. And the reason I emphasize that, particularly here in ODI, is the second part, which is that the impacts are enormous and cruelly are going to affect the poorest, the least able to deal with them the worst, the people who had the least amount to do with the situation that we are in the worst. The third thing, though, that I think is critical for us to remember, and we're seeing it all around the world, is that massive progress on these issues actually is possible. Not only as a result of the Paris Agreement, this has been going on for a long time, but some countries will maybe hear more about this, like India and China, have already begun to put things in place that have outstripped some of the ambition of the commitments that were agreed to only a couple of years ago. This is, of course, also true in the United States, where 14% of the 27%, or roughly thereabouts, commitment was already met. And so massive progress is possible. But, and this is the kicker for me, you know, the United States is the largest historic polluter on the planet, remains the second largest polluter in the world today. So what the United States does about its own Paris commitment does actually matter. It's wonderful to see states and cities and corporations stepping up to say that they're going to do something, despite what happened on Thursday with President Trump pulling out of the agreement. But don't kid yourself into thinking that what the US federal government doesn't matter. It's also because the US government has heretofore been one of the biggest donors in helping other countries to meet their commitments. When I was traveling just now, you see people, again, this is not abstraction, people are making decisions every day about whether to invest in a solar field or in a new coal power plant. Those micro decisions, which happen all over the planet every day, are made one way or another based on small nudge factors, resources that are available, political will, financial commitments. If those things dissipate, then action will likely dissipate as well. So it is really my honor to welcome everybody here for this conversation today. Thank you for those who are online. If you're interested in joining this conversation, you can send us questions. You can also tweet using the hashtag Global Challenges. And let me turn over to our contributing chair, Isabel Hilton. Isabel is a renowned writer and broadcaster and founder and editor of China Dialogue, an independent organization based in London, Beijing, and San Francisco. So over to you, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think since that billing was drawn up, I should perhaps update it to London, Beijing, Delhi, and Sao Paulo, where we think that climate discussions might be even more fruitful than San Francisco. China Dialogue is a bilingual Chinese-English website which publishes in both directions on all aspects of climate and environment. We've been going about 11 years now, and we now publish in 8 languages across 4 websites on all these issues. So we sit in London in terms of the head office, but we are very much engaged with the world that our panel is also engaged in. And it's a particular pleasure for me to be in this company at this moment, discussing this issue with you all. So welcome to all of you in the room, and welcome to all of you online. The tweet, just to remind you, is hashtag Global Challenges. And those of you who are watching remotely can send in questions, and I will get them, I believe, on this iPad. We have yet to test this system, so I hope it works. So let me welcome the speakers. On my immediate right, Kumi Naidu, who's the launch director of this new initiative, Africans Rising. He's the former international executive director of Greenpeace, and I'm sure known to many of you, been involved in these issues for a very long time. On his immediate right, Sheila Wickley, who is an in-house expert and head of the program of climate and energy. We had the pleasure of working on fossil fuel subsidies over the last few years. And on her immediate right, Stuart James, who's the managing director and deputy head of group for government affairs for HSBC. And so the format is we're going to hear something from our speakers. We're then going to have a general discussion here, and then we're going to widen the discussion both to those of you in the room and to people watching online. So I want to start with you, Kumi, and I know you've just flown in from South Africa, so thank you for being awake first. We're extremely impressed. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And I think the question that's on everybody's mind, of course, is the US withdrawal and what's the meaning, not the motivation, but what's the meaning, the impact, the result of the US withdrawal as you see it now?
I think, thank you and good morning, everybody. To answer that question, one needs to contextualize a few things. First, we should probably go back, we can go back much further, but maybe we start with the first climate negotiations in Rio, where George Bush Sr. wagged his finger and said, the American way of life is non-negotiable, right? Then fast forward to Copenhagen in 2009, where we went there trying to secure what we called a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. What we got in Copenhagen was a FLAB outcome, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? So when we were going to Paris, 6 years later, we said, we're not going to talk about the road to Paris. We're going to talk about the road through Paris, because we saw Paris as an important moment. We knew that the politics was not aligned to give us the kind of deal that we actually wanted out of Paris. And therefore, when we hear this outcome statement from Trump, we need to then look at what were people around the world saying about the Paris Agreement. Because right now, there's been quite an interesting reportage over the last, say, 3-4 days, because I did one interview, for example, with a television station in New York called Democracy Now, and I said that Trump's long speech could be seen as one of the longest suicide notes to the world, in the sense that essentially if Trump's intention prevails, right, then in fact we are talking about a slippery slope to climate catastrophe much faster than anybody anticipated. But just to remind ourselves, we said that the Paris Agreement gave us the space to live to fight another day, right? The Paris Agreement, from the Global South perspective, from the environmental justice movements and so on, we didn't see it as a unqualified success. Okay, it's important that we remind ourselves of that. But what we did succeed to do in Paris was build in what we called a ratcheting mechanism, right, which is this 5-year review, because the ambitions on the table and the commitments made on the table is actually taking us to absolute climate catastrophe anyway, right?
Just remind people of the pledges made, where they take us
Okay,
in
so
temperature
yeah,
terms.
so depending exactly how you count it, and there's always difficulties in the counting, but the pledges on the table at the moment is taking us at least to a 3.54 degree world. Okay, so you got that reality based on what countries said they're going to do. If you take everything that countries said they're going to do and put it on the table before Trump's speech, we're heading for a 4-degree world. But then you look at the document, and we fought really, really hard to have 1.5 degrees in play. And let me just say that 1.5, for me personally, in 2015, I went through a very deeply emotional process around it. And you might wonder, how could you go through an emotional process around a figure which has degrees at the end? Because in July, in 2015, I was in the Pacific, and people were chanting, the slogan they were chanting, 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. 6 months later, when we got to Paris, the very same people that I saw were chanting, 1.5, we might survive. So within that context, Trump's decision is problematic because it takes, as Alex said, the biggest historical polluter out of the picture, where that player is not willing to live up to their expectations. It sends a wrong kind of sense about urgency about the problem of climate change. But I want to conclude this answer by just bullet pointing the positive things. Fundamentally, I think Trump's statement has some positive things in it. Firstly, Trump is reviled amongst the majority of people in the world. And if Trump gets up and says the climate change agreement is bad and climate change is a non-issue, then hopefully it's going to galvanize a large number of people. And within a couple of days, you are seeing that across the world, right? And suddenly, climate is a conversation again. And let's be clear that we need to be having significantly more conversations about climate change given how serious it is than we are having. And there has been a little bit of a sense, oh, we got the Paris Agreement, we got the SDGs in September, we got things more or less on track now, let's just go back and, more or less business as usual. So Trump has sent us a message that it cannot be business as usual. Secondly, the US pulling out of the treaty, fundamentally it's a problem. But bear in mind that the US in every negotiations in climate has pushed for minimalism, right? The level of ambition in Paris Accord would have been significantly higher if the US wasn't one of the negotiators in it, okay? So that opens up a little bit of, but more importantly, it's galvanized people in the United States. I'm not sure whether everybody knows that former mayor of New York, Bloomberg, has led an initiative where he's brought together mayors, governors of certain states. At this stage, it's only 3 states, and American business, the progressive elements of it. And they've now starting a dialogue with the United Nations saying, we as American people and institutions are going to live up to the commitments that our government made in Paris, and they're mobilizing money, they're mobilizing the kinds of infrastructure that's needed and so on. So bluntly, it's obviously not a good thing, but, we have to have an attitude right now where if we take last week's statement as a moment for us to be demobilized, depressed, anxious, frustrated, this is the last thing we want to do. We need to actually take a deep breath, and as Christiana Figueres said, she said she had 35 minutes of grief.
No, she seemed to go through the stages of grief in about 30 seconds and came out saying thank you because Trump had mobilized the opposition. So
Both within and both within the US and globally. So let me end by saying that for a person who comes from a continent that collectively carries very limited levels of historical responsibility for the accumulation of carbon and other greenhouse trapping gases, for a person who comes from a continent where we are losing lives and infrastructure now, as Alex observed in his visit just recently, we are seeing the intensification of climate-intensified drought, climate-intensified desertification, climate-intensified flooding, and so on, and where we are seeing parts of the African continent becoming depopulated now as a result of water scarcity, land scarcity, giving you the toxic mix of food scarcity. From a person coming from that kind of background, can I say, what a deep, deep betrayal the position that the US president would take, given the historical responsibility the US carries, given that 65% of the American people want action, and given that Donald Trump's children are as important beneficiaries to taking climate action as the child of an African woman peasant farmer in a small unknown village anywhere in Africa. So within that context, I think we must understand that it's a deep betrayal.
Thank you very much. I've been asked just to say something about China at this point, which I'm very happy to do. And one of the things that's been striking, I think, in the last few months, since it became clear that Trump at least had an ambivalent position since the American election, there has been some focus on the question of whether, in the absence of what people rather indulgently call US climate leadership, whether China might step up. They are both the biggest emitters. China, the biggest emitter; the US, the second biggest emitter in by volume. Although, as you know, you can cut these numbers many different ways. And whether, and there have been some very interesting signals from China on that score, beginning with Xi Jinping in Davos, where he steps up and says China is a responsible, reliable partner. We will not resile from our commitments, and followed up by any number of statements from senior officials, including Li Keqiang in his visit to Europe last week, and the EU-China statement on climate change. So I think that there is no doubt. And actually, I never did have a lot of doubt about China's commitment to the Paris Agreement. And I think just going back over how profound that commitment is might be helpful, because I do find people sometimes haven't quite understood how far the Chinese position has come since Copenhagen, when China was certainly identified by many, and not only by advanced countries or famously by the Maldives, as the kind of bad boy in Copenhagen. So what's been happening in the decade that I've been looking closely at China's climate policy is an accumulation of the domestic impacts of the industrial model, which are manifest in air, water, soil pollution, which makes the government politically vulnerable. It's a sensitive topic, even for an authoritarian government. So that had to be addressed. Also, the fact that they are engineers means that they get the physics. They have no problem about the science, and climate denial is not a huge issue in China. There was a reluctance to commit to, they were a non-Annex 1 signatory of the Kyoto Protocol, which meant that they did not have to take on mandatory emissions cuts. And China 10 years ago was also still addressing the question of its own development and had chosen a particularly carbon-intensive model. So all of that had to be thought about before this great emissions tanker could be turned around in any way. But between Copenhagen and Paris, a remarkable transformation did indeed take place. And it was partly the result of the input from a lot of expert opinion around the Central Committee and the Politburo as to the dangers of climate change for China. But it was also the result of the point in the economic cycle that China had reached, which was that very dirty, high-polluting industrial model was becoming exhausted. And this is a pattern that you see in every Asian tiger. China is just a very, very big Asian tiger in this respect, that you start off moving your population off the land into factories, making cheap T-shirts, cigarette lighters, high volume, low wage economy, driven disproportionately by investment and exports. As your wage levels rise and your labor becomes more expensive, you move up the value chain. You start assembling technology, and eventually you start inventing it. And China had got to the point where the old industrial model was exhausted, and it is and still is contemplating the complexities of the middle income trap and the question of what the next generation of technologies will be and how can China dominate them with its still substantial manufacturing capacity, and how is it to make its living in its post-dirty industrial world. And somewhere around the beginning of the 12th five-year plan, we're halfway through the 13th now, those technologies and that future was identified as a low-carbon future. They looked at the world and they said, we are going to need energy efficiency, we are going to need clean technologies, we China are going to invest in these for our own manufacturing capacity, we are going to invest in leading research in all aspects of clean technologies, and we will be the supplier to a carbon-constrained global market. So by the time you get to the run-up to Paris, China had a strategic economic interest in a global deal. Now, that doesn't mean it was bound to happen. And the other key factor in that, in enabling it to happen, was the relationship with the Obama administration, the relationship with the United States. I don't know if any of you follow this discussion on this Thucydides trap, which has been very live in the States. This is the theory that a rising power and an established or declining power will always come to war, much discussed in the context of China and the United States. Will there be conflict, or will there be a new set of international relations which will allow the rise of a power as big as China to be peaceful? I only mention it because China's gaze is almost always fixed on the United States, and the United States' gaze is very often fixed on China, and this is a political complication domestically. To transform that into a constructive conversation around climate was incredibly important and very successful. So at a time when US-China diplomatic relations were pretty toxic, that one very positive aspect of them was the climate discussion. And that was a combination of technical support, of diplomatic support, and of the construction of that conversation as a winning conversation for both of them. And so the US-China climate conversations and statements were absolutely key enablers of the Paris Agreement. So where are we now? The one partner has left the stage yet again. I think that China clearly will not, as I said, resile from its commitments, but it has been slightly thrust into a leadership position with which it is not entirely comfortable. This is not a position that China would have wished to be in terms of the global diplomacy, but nevertheless, a lot is going to be expected of China at this point in terms of being a solid partner. And I think that China is expressing that through the statements with the EU. But if we were to expect China to do the kind of mobilizing of the diplomatic map that is going to be required around Paris, I'm not sure we're going to see that. That's not what China has experience of. It's not what China's particularly good at. And China will be looking for partners and looking for encouragement in going forward. In terms of its own INDCs, they're absolutely well within its comfort zone. So will China then be keen to ratchet up in the kind of leadership to a degree that would express leadership? We shall see. China also has laggards within its own economy. It's exporting emissions through building coal-fired power stations abroad. You know, it's a big country and it's a curate's egg in terms of climate policy. But I think that the message, certainly in the last, well, actually since Paris, has been pretty positive. And it's a pity that the United States has gone the way it's gone. But below government to government level, there are, again, all sorts of partnerships which will continue. Jerry Brown is in Beijing right now at the Clean Energy Ministerial. City to city, state to province partnerships will continue. So, you know, it's not the end. It's not the end of the road, and it's not the end of China's commitment by any means. So I think I've said enough. Now I'm going to move on to, I think, Sheila, you're next on the list. Yes, you are next on the list. So, as I mentioned that we worked, we had the pleasure of working with you on the question of fossil fuel subsidies, which is, you know, when the discussion of energy happens, everybody points out that renewable energies get subsidies and somehow this is unfair. But not many people appreciate the degree to which the fossil fuel industry is a subsidy junkie. And, you know, we are not making a whole lot of progress on that. There was no mention of it in the Paris Agreement. And I just, you know, as long as they are there, what are the implications? How big an obstacle is this to moving forward from Paris?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. Our work at ODI has focused on fossil fuel subsidies for about 4 years, and it came in the context of actually wider work on private climate finance. So in the context of the UNFCCC, there were commitments made in Copenhagen around climate finance and mobilizing both public climate finance and mobilizing private investment to address climate change. And as you've noted, one of the sort of early discoveries of the work that we did looking at private climate finance is the degree to which governments currently use instruments to support fossil fuels, primarily to support fossil fuels over and above clean energy or energy efficiency. So when we were trying to understand what levers a government could use to mobilize, I guess, climate finance, we quickly saw that you could look at these instruments that governments were using to actually put most of their support behind oil, gas, and coal. We've done research which finds, we primarily look at the G20 because there's a G20 commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies that's found that G20 governments every year provide on average 450 billion of support to fossil fuels. And I think we'll talk a little bit more in the conversation later about kind of why that happens. But I guess in the context of that, one would expect, and I think we anticipated in the Paris Agreement, that we may get language for the first time actually mentioning fossil fuels or talking about solutions to addressing fossil fuel-based energy and transitioning away from fossil fuel-based energy. What we found was that in the end, there was no mention, as you said, of fossil fuels in the Paris Agreement. There's actually no mention of almost any of the specific solutions in the Paris Agreement. So you don't have a mention of carbon pricing. You don't have a mention of a number of sort of the kind of fiscal or other tools that you would expect to sort of that governments should be using to solve the climate crisis. But I think what Kumi mentioned, and in some ways, although it's not a specific mention of addressing fossil fuels, is that you have this target. You have a 1.5 degree target, which is a broad goal, but in order to meet it, you actually have really strict restrictions in terms of what can be exploited in terms of fossil fuels. So if governments are actually to meet the 2 degree goal or even come close to meeting the 1.5 degree goal, what researchers have found is that actually most of the reserves that we currently have of oil and gas, this is not including coal, most of those reserves that are currently in production, that's basically all that you can use. So we can't explore for more oil and gas. We can't really develop kind of newly discovered reserves. What it is sort of reserves that have steel and cement attached to them now is all that we can use in order to stay within those that climate, that temperature goal. And that creates a real sort of framework under which civil society and others can engage with governments around then what is possible and what governments have to do, both in terms of curtailing demand for fossil fuels, but also addressing supply of fossil fuels. And I think there have been, as has already been mentioned, there's been sort of very positive developments that we're seeing, and I would argue there's reasons right now to be very angry, and there's also reasons to be very optimistic. I find it quite difficult because I feel almost sometimes hourly, especially in the last week, I sort of waver between the two, because the climate impacts that we're seeing are happening much faster than we would have expected. The kind of the damage and the risks are higher, but also the technological innovations are happening at paces that are really, I think, other than Greenpeace's predictions, the predictions for solar costs are far different than what was expected. So we're seeing these transitions in places like India that are happening much faster. So governments now have to really look carefully at how they can address fossil fuel supply and demand, and the Paris Agreement creates a framework for that and kind of ratcheting objectives to get there. In terms of fossil fuel subsidies, again, although they're not mentioned within the Paris Agreement, and we have a paper, I think some of them, copies of it are outside, there are some specific places within the framework of the Paris Agreement that governments can address fossil fuel subsidies. So one of the big ones, as I said, we started looking at climate finance, is making all public finance, so not just climate finance, aligned with the 1.5 degree goal. So that means that public institutions, multilateral development banks, our bilateral financial institutions should not be providing support to oil, gas, and coal. So that's moving public support away from oil, gas, and coal, and ensuring that, in particular, climate finance is not being used to support fossil fuel production and use. Also, the nationally determined contributions under the UNFCCC, there are already a number of governments that have put in place objectives to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and it's underneath these commitments and these contributions is a place where governments can put forward these commitments to kind of support each other, and also that public finance and development finance can be used to support governments to phase out subsidies. And then also we have there's a longer term strategies, these 2050 plans, where this phase out of fossil fuels overall in the energy sector can be part of those objectives. So there's obviously, even though there's not a mention of fossil fuels, there's a number of places within the Paris Agreement that this issue can be addressed.
So it's important to keep that awareness alive.
Yeah.
And we're going to come back. Yes.
Just a small clarification. When you said only Greenpeace got it right, actually the truth is that was a reference to predicting the solar and wind pricing and how it will come down. And that prediction was made towards the time that I started. The truth be said, we also got it wrong, because basically the International Energy Agency or World Bank, everybody got it wrong in terms of how cheap solar and wind will become. It's just that Greenpeace got it least wrong. Yes. We were closest to being wrong.
It's an imperfect world.
Yeah.
Well done. So Stuart, I'm going to bring you in here. HSBC, big bank. We've seen this, chorus from businesses around the world, but also in the United States, urging Trump, not to take the decision that he just took, because it's bad for them, it's bad for the economy, it's the wrong future. Why do you think he didn't listen?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is broadly political. But just before I go into that, it reminds me there's a famous joke in the UK, which it's around the relationship between the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. It says fog in the Channel, continent isolated. And it reminds me a little bit of this situation where we're all sort of tempted to say, the US leaves the Paris Accord, rest of the world isolated. And of course, exactly the opposite is true. And so if you really sort of ask the question, why are people seemingly both sort of morally annoyed, but economically so far relatively relaxed about this, I think it's because the judgment that people in business and I think other politicians throughout the world are making is that this set of policy actions has reached escape velocity, and that the path that we're all in, while a decision like the one that Trump made last week will have an impact and does make things a little bit more bumpy, it probably doesn't fundamentally alter the trend direction that we're on. So coming back to why he made the decision, well, particularly my role in HSBC, it's not really for me to judge politics, but it's absolutely clear that he, in his campaign, said that this is one of the things he was going to do. And for most politicians, the ability to follow through on that and appeal to the base that has voted for you is a pretty strong attraction, particularly if you believe that actually most of the rest of the world is going to carry on pretty much as it was. I don't want to say it's a costless thing to do, that would be wrong. But I just wonder what the impact is really going to be, in terms of economics on the US. You mentioned the other constituencies of support. So, we heard from Kumi about the fact that there's a group of mayors and governors that have, if you like, have stepped into what you might call the political vacuum to continue in the right direction. But you also have leading US firms, including in the energy sector, that are also in favour of membership of Paris, and they are also continuing to make investments increasingly of a sustainable nature and see things moving in that direction. So I think many of the other key actors in a practical sense are going to continue to move in the direction that we would wish them to. And to some extent, this was a political thing for him to do in a political game.
Can I just prod you a bit, though, on the kind of unstoppable nature of it? And Christiana Figueres talked just after Paris in about mobilizing finance. And she, I mean, apart from the billions that might or might not eventually get into the Green Climate Fund, what really counts is moving the trillions. And that has been a big source of frustration. The pension funds are still not really, into factoring climate into their decisions. Very little of the great financial institutions, very few of the great financial institutions seem to understand the risks of climate change. Why have they been so slow?
Well, let's take the second part of that question first. I mean, I think large financial institutions, like any large institution, they tend to react on uncertainty and they make judgments about risk. So one of the important things about Paris, particularly, of course, with America on board, is that it gives a degree of certainty as to what the sort of policy environment is likely to be in the future. And that signal alone is exactly the sort of thing you need for the world of finance to begin to respond and make the necessary changes internally to the way that they work in order to make, if you like, a different risk perception. Even still, it takes judgment. We can still, even in this room, have different views about the extent to which or the time frame in which we will be able to begin to achieve some of the Paris objectives. But if you judge that the state of the world in the future is such that it's going to move us from a sort of fossil fuel world to a low carbon economy, then you begin inside a large bank or an asset manager to make different judgments about the risk you're putting your assets at, depending on the investments you make, and you move them into the right sort of area. So why is it apparently slow? Well, Paris wasn't that long ago, and I think it takes a while for large institutions to sort of change the way in which they do all that internal methodological thinking and begin, if you like, to reflect the fact that in the future we see a world of no fossil fuel subsidies, which makes an enormous difference in terms of where you think it is wise, even from just a financial, never mind a moral sense, to put your money. There's a slightly different question. The first part of your question was about, pension funds, these long-term asset managers. And actually, I think there are a number of sort of, not technical answers, but certainly policy-based answers to your question about why that takes time. It's a very interesting, we really need a dating agency. If you ask those who have the money to invest why they don't invest it in this huge multi-trillion infrastructure gap that's there, they say, well, we don't really have financially viable projects. Yeah. And if you ask the people who have the infrastructure needs, they say, well, we've got the infrastructure need, we've got a perfectly good project here, we just can't get the money. And unfortunately, you have to sort of dig below that. Some of it can be about perception, but some of it is also about reality and the need to do a little bit of sort of engineering in order to allow that money to flow to the kind of projects we want it to flow to. So a typical example might be, say, on just something as simple as disclosure. There aren't at the moment universal and commonly understood standards of disclosure for, say, climate risk, which could apply to a company or it could apply to an infrastructure project. But there is really good work going on through the FSB task force under the umbrella of the G20 to try
Could you just explain the FSB task force for those who might not know what that is?
Yeah, so the FSB, that's the Financial Stability Board, led by Mark Carney, our Bank of England governor here. It began to look at this question from a prudential risk management. In other words, are banks putting their money at risk if they continue to invest in, say, traditional fossil fuels, investing in companies, the assets of which, i.e. coal in the ground, may never be economically viable to bring out. And so rather than see this, as, if you like, as a political question or a moral question, the way we all do, he said, well, actually, let's just look at it from a banking regulatory point of view. And he made a speech, essentially, which pointed out that the kind of changes, the problem is that some of the changes that we expect to see in the way that the world will adapt to them are a little bit over the time horizon, over the decision-making processes of politicians, of financial regulators, of company CEOs. So they all tend to miss the important information that should really be determining their actions.
So that's an institutional mismatch, isn't it?
That's right. And disclosure is at the heart of that, and developing metrics to be able to actually factor in, if you like, the risk that your company strategy is at for being either in line or out of line with a 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature rise. But if you can get a methodological approach whereby financial institutions and all the large corporates in key sectors are providing that information to investors, then you begin to move the money. So that's the first policy thing that hopefully we will see. The second one is public-private risk sharing, but we can come to that later.
Right, but I don't want you to think I'm picking on you, Stuart.
No,
but
go on.
We have a question here from one of our online viewers, which is about HSBC. So Rose Simons would like to know, does HSBC have plans to update your lending policies for high-carbon clients to reflect the goals of the Paris Agreement, be that through engagement or exclusion? She introduces that question with congratulations on your general posture, I should say, but then would like to know whether inside the bank you're following through.
So, I mean, we have a number of sort of policies, as you would expect in any organisation, around this field and other fields, Indigenous people rights, etc. And we always are prepared to look at these and say, are we up to date with the current thinking? We often take as our benchmark, what the current thinking is in other leading firms, and or what is the World Bank, the IFC doing, etc. What we're doing in HSBC on this issue at the moment, and we're at the start of a process, is looking at all of our business lines, whether it be straight lending, bond underwriting, advisory services around projects, etc. We're looking at all our global business lines, and we're asking the heads of these business lines to tell us what being in line with the 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature rise means for their business in making that transition. And then that will then go in their scorecards, as we call them. So from that point onwards, they will be judged about whether they're making progress along that line. Now, to come back to the questions that Rose asked, we need to see exactly how that looks. But impressionistically, I will say that will mean that business managers within HSBC, will have to take a judgment at some point if they are running too high an exposure to firms which are not prepared to make the change to a low carbon economy. And if so, they'll have to think about reducing that exposure. And they'll have to be on the lookout for new clients, of course, who are consistent with it. And now I don't want to get the impression, particularly to any clients that are on the line, that we see this as a sort of, we're just going to drop those who are, are slightly on the wrong side of the line or are a bit traditional. I think we see it very much as just as we are working out what this change means for us and going through it, that we should be taking our clients along that change too. And we will work to do that. But these are the hard decisions we'll have to make.
So Sheila and Kumi, we're just going back to the question of the impact of the US withdrawal. I mean, we've talked a bit about leadership and momentum, which is one issue. But while we're on the question of the money, what does that mean? You both think a lot about the impact on the poorest people and the commitments to support poorer countries to make a transition or indeed to deal with the impacts. Do you anticipate that the US withdrawal from Paris is going to have a big effect on the money available?
Well, I guess I think that that climate finance is very important, and the fact that the U.S. has specifically basically said they're not going to fulfill their commitment under the Green Climate Fund is significant. I think, however, that, as some have mentioned, that is the realm of the billions. Right. And what we would hope is that this sort of galvanizing force will mean that a number of the other countries who are committed to the Paris Agreement will potentially step up and provide support in place of the United States, which can fill the gap in terms of specific climate finance under the UNFCCC. But I think our work at ODI and the work of others is really, has moved towards this question of the shifting trillions. And that is about, again, this question of fiscal incentives, carbon pricing, fossil fuel subsidies, et cetera, that And the reason that the U.S.'s federal role is still very important is that you need governments to send these signals. I mean, the private sector, I would argue, is really often following the signals that are sent by government. And the governments have economic tools, regulatory tools, information instruments that they're using all the time that shapes private money. And governments of every single country in the world have, I guess, to a more or greater degree, an ability to use whatever budget resources they have, or limited budget resources supported by climate finance or development assistance, to shape their economies. And a big shift can happen in some ways just pulling away support from high carbon activities, because even that can level the playing field for low carbon activities. It doesn't necessarily require new resources. And I guess in the context of fossil fuel subsidy reform, what we see is often governments are not taking fossil fuel subsidies away and giving that to renewables under a sort of hypothecation. What you see is governments taking subsidies away and potentially using that for public transportation, for healthcare investment, for education, for spending in other areas.
But also changing the price ratio by removing the subsidy.
Yeah, which means that you have a leveling of the playing field. So I think, this is what Paris creates the space for, is governments to use resources differently, to use levers in a different way, which then will change the overall financial picture. And obviously disclosure is a part and parcel of that. But I think the Green Climate Fund, although it's a kind of terrible symbol in terms of fairness and support to developing countries, if other governments step up, it doesn't necessarily mean sort of the end of an ability for countries to shift towards both low carbon but also sort of resilient futures.
So just, Kumi, picking up on that, how is it seen in Africa in terms of the richest country and the biggest historical emitter, no longer contributing, but also, given that the United States has not withdrawn from UNFCCC, and given that it's not going to get out of Paris until 3.5 years have passed, US electoral cycle comes to mind, How much do you think the US is likely to play a blocking role inside the continuing discussions in Paris, even having given the signal that they're going to leave?
Firstly, I'd like to fully endorse everything Shelak said. I think this question is a hard one to call about having made the statement, how destructive is the US administration going to seek to be within what the other nations of the world do. It's hard to call it. I can see pros and cons for which way it will pull, but as I said in one of the interviews I did the day he made his announcement, I said, you know, for us in Africa, we're not going to make a judgment of the American people based on what a quasi-fascist, crazy president says. Okay, right?
I don't know who you're talking about.
Yeah. And we'll remember, by the way, all the leaders of the world who have adjusted to his presence, including the one that sits in the capital here. But what we will judge the American people by is how they respond to this very irresponsible decision that he's made. So I'm reading two things from your comments just to make you smile a little bit, right? If you take these two things. So Isabel is actually saying that much as Trump might want to walk away from it tomorrow, actually by the time they follow the process to get out of the agreement that they signed in Paris, it will be exactly at the time of the next presidential elections, right? So that's a good thing because we guaranteed now that climate will be a central part of the US elections, and that in itself is a good thing because we know then that makes it a global conversation again, which we need to track and intervene to ensure that we bring to that conversation a message of urgency. On the other hand, if Mayor Bloomberg and the other captains of certain big companies in the United States who pay far too less tax to start with and will probably pay much less tax if Trump gets away with his tax reform, then we will read into the statement that he made out of Paris last week when he stood next to Macron and said, the American people will meet all the obligations that we signed up to in Paris, irrespective if the federal government and Trump doesn't want to do it. So, Mr. Bloomberg, if you are hearing this, or your people are, you need to know that we are understanding that it's actually in relative terms a small amount of money for US business, which actually makes a huge amount of money based on resource extraction out of Africa and elsewhere, that it's not an unreasonable expectation that US business will actually fill the gap of the US government. But I'm just tempted to say something about the finance conversation that was on the table, right? So here's a very simple thing, right? What are the two most difficult things that happens in the public conversation which leaves out 99% of the people, including people who are educated? I would say the two things that are most impenetrable, unless you are a specialist in those two areas, is climate and finance. The world of finance and the world of climate, right? Separately speaking, right? Listen, for my sins, I have a PhD from a university here, and when I watch the financial news on the news bulletin, I can tell you, as a person who didn't train in economics, it's a bloody concentration to follow exactly what they are talking about, right? So what I'm saying is that part of the problem we have is we've got these very mystified worlds of finance and climate. And I tell you on climate, I want to make a friendly criticism of people like myself and the activist community that we need to start learning to speak like human beings on climate, right? Because we speak about it, we get locked into the jargon, and we pretend as if we all are in the conversation. And I'm going to do a small experiment now, right? And please be honest in how you ask the question. You've heard this figure 1.5 and 2 degrees, okay? How many of you know where we are now towards, don't put your hand up, right? I mean, don't answer it. And just to be clear, for anybody listening who might when they say that figure, they are saying that from the start of the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning oil, coal, and gas, from that moment into the future, we cannot have a rise beyond 1.5 degrees. Now, towards that 1.5 degrees, how many of you firstly know how much we have warmed up already towards 1.5 degrees? How many of you know the answer? Please raise your hands. Okay, so see, Shilag is going like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It's not a majority, is it? Yeah.
No, it's not a majority. It's not even a quarter. And just so you know, when I was at Greenpeace offices, I always used to ask this question, and I used to get a similar response. Okay, so but the conversation has been framed in a way that we will be left out of it, right? By throwing 350 parts per million, LULUCF. Anybody knows what LULUCF is?
Oh, God.
Oh, you know? You sad person, you. Land use change for forestry, right? So basically, we're at 1.1, right? If we, okay, so let me just say on this finance issue, right? I'm trying to connect it. Think about it from this way. If at 1.1, right, in the last 10 years, we've had more than 100% increase in extreme weather events globally, right? Now, just think, the shit is hitting the fan already. It's not as if the shit has not started hitting the fan. And I want to say something uncomfortable now. Richard Curtis, people know him? 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, the movie producer, but also activist within Comic Relief. And he was with us in the Make Poverty History campaign in 2005. And he said something that has stuck with me in this climate conversation. He said, in the middle of the Make Poverty History campaign, he said, you know, if 7,000 people were dying in Europe from HIV, from malaria alone every day, if 6,000 people were dying from HIV/AIDS in North America, you know, as is happening daily on the African continent, if 3,000 people are dying of tuberculosis, as is every day in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, you can rest assured we would have fixed the problem a long time ago. And I want to ask you to think about this very uncomfortable question. Would the urgency be different if the color of the skins of the people that are in the front line of climate impacts, often those that carry the least responsibility, would it be different? And when we look at the reality, I would say what Richard Curtis said on poverty totally applies to climate. But here's the problem for activists in the climate movement. People like myself stand guilty for using this stupid phrase, save the planet. Right? No, seriously, I want to suggest to you that save the planet.
People. Yeah.
Save the planet is not a good thing. The planet actually does not need saving. Because the trajectory we're on is that if we continue to warm on the way that we are, the end result is our water dries up, our soil gets destroyed, we can't plant food, it's too hot to survive. We will be gone. The planet actually will still be here. It'll be brewed, battered, and scarred by humanity's crimes on it. But truth be said, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. Don't worry about the planet. This struggle is fundamentally about whether humanity can make a massive economic and social transition to a point where humanity learns to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's future. Now, just what I've said, just those words, they might not sound very brilliant and very, intelligent and jargony. But when we say to no ordinary people, this struggle is about protecting our children and their children, just that sentence opens up the conversation to more people feeling they have a stake. When you're talking about degrees and emissions levels and so on, and I think we have this problem both with finance as well as with climate, but just to say that on the finance side, since I've left Greenpeace, most of my climate work has been to build a new climate finance campaign. It's going to be located within Climate Action Network, CAN International, We have got a multi-layered campaign. The finance thing is very complicated. As a non-finance person, I deliberately wanted to do this so that I could bring, hopefully, some normalcy, into terms of words we use. But there's so many different levels of the campaign, from divest from fossil fuels, invest in renewables, which is aimed at pension funds, foundations, trusts, universities, and so on. That's got $4 trillion that has been earmarked for divestment in the space of 3 years, but much more to be done. Then what we're seeing at another level, when we are campaigning against what we call carbon bomb projects, like the big Australia coal mine, normally we would go after the Adani, Prime Minister Modi's big friend in India. We'd go after the company that's building the coal mine. But we put that on hold because we went after all the banks that were thinking about financing it and got every international and Australian bank to say no. So we need to build the capacity of people to deal with how do you do financial campaigning. There are various layers more, but I'm reading Isabel's body language there, and I won't go into the details.
I could, of course, listen to you all day, Kumi, but unfortunately we don't have it.
Yeah.
Just on the point about the colour of the skin and the impacts, I don't disagree with you, but I think that there's a more profound problem with climate change, which is how do you render urgent what is a long, slow background event, and that has always been a storytelling problem with climate change. I was watching Arnie Schwarzenegger, the Terminator governor, coming back at Trump, and he mentioned, and I don't want to say the figure because I might get it wrong, but it's tens of thousands of people who die in the United States every year prematurely because of air pollution.
Yeah.
We have this problem in London. Is this on the front page of the news? Hardly at all. If those figures of deaths were associated with another event, it would be, of course, it would change government policy overnight. So there is a problem, and Greenpeace was always very good at messaging. It was always very good at turning background events into, creating symbols for them and creating those stories. But it is difficult with climate change, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want, I've got another question on my iPad, and I know there are some questions in the room. So can I just, while we're collecting those, there is a question on the more, just very quickly on the finance, the kind of methodologies that exist in the insurance industry for assessing risk. Are they applicable in terms of the wider finance approach to climate change? Have they been applied, and would they be helpful? I think it's roughly, I praise you slightly, yeah, including disclosure.
I think any work that's been done in the insurance industry is a first mover in this can certainly teach us something, but it's not entirely the same thing because the kind of calculations that say a cement manufacturer will do to work out how exposed it is, or an oil and gas company, is going to be sort of slightly different. I mean, from a bank, for example, we have to look at our clients primarily. That's our sort of first order look at it and say, well, what trajectory are they on, and what does that mean for our own risk calculations over the assets that we're holding? And that's a slightly different question than the insurance company. But we're factoring in the work that is going on in the G20. It includes the insurance specialists who have, as I say, trailblazed to some extent on these questions to ensure that we capture their knowledge.
Because, of course, they're shelling out for the impact. So a gentleman there had a question. Lots of questions. So we're going to